I'm Jonathan Holslag. I work as a professor of international politics at the Free University of Brussels. I'm also involved in the China Institute of that very university, so I try to have a focus on the world at large, but on Asia most of the time in specific.
And how or why did you become hooked to the European Union or to Europe?
Well, I must confess that in general my career has developed quite capriciously. Initially I started in Africa, working on African affairs, rebel groups in Congo, and then I was almost forced to start to work on Asia by my supervisor. And then now it's Europe. Why Europe? Well, first of all, by traveling extensively to the Asian region. Also by talking to a lot of decision makers and business folks from Asia, it really became clear to me that well, Europe is in a quite an uncomfortable position nowadays. That also in terms of perception, it's going down rapidly. And that basically instigated me to ask the very straightforward question, well, how bad is our position, how bad is our situation as a market, as a society, as a political constellation, as an international actor. As a second question, how does the evolving international order, the very, I would say, uncertain and turbulent international order, work on that fragile European construction, and then thirdly, what can be done about it. I come from a school of real policy, of real political realism, so that third question was not all too evident for me, but I still thought it was useful to ask it.
And that brings me to my next question: is how would you define the state of Europe in 2014? Maybe are we at the height of the integration project if we look back, let's say 20 years' time? What do you think?
Well, of course, it has been said many times that Europe was in a dead struggle, that it was reaching its terminal stage. We had that in the 60s, we had that during the crisis of the 70s, in the 80s, and then also in the 90s, and then each time still Europe came out of those episodes of uncertainty in a stronger way. Still, in spite of that observation, which I think is correct to a large degree, I think this crisis is different. It is different in a sense that altogether the world order has changed. And it will make it less easier for us to adjust as we did in the past. My analysis is that we are with the European project in a crisis that is fourfold. First of all, and that has been the most manifest in the last years, I think there is a collective action problem at the European level. There is a crisis of European politics being reflected by the fact that we basically dragged us from the one crisis summit to the other, but that also many of the negotiations, now very complicated negotiations, have moved to more discrete committee meetings, but still where national power politics is very, very blatant and outspoken. Yeah. Then, of course, the second question and the second issue is, well, where does that come from, that collective action problem? It's not new, has been there for a long, long time, but I think it's still rooted in an underlying trend that is, for me, more important, and it is the weakening of what I call the pragmatic elites in the member states. That's the weakening of the centrum parties, the pragmatic parties that used to bear the European project in the previous decades. And that electoral shift is really sliding towards a very critical point. I have done an evaluation of the evolving electoral results over all the member states throughout the last 20 years. And we are now approaching a position in which the electoral share, so to speak, of the centrum parties, for the first time in history, at least since World War II, will become smaller than a colorful array of populist parties, conservative parties, extremist parties, and so forth. But also that for the first time since World War II, the share of people that do not vote any longer will be bigger than the share of those centrum parties. So I think that that's really crucial, that the political players that spearheaded European integration do no longer have the same weight electorally in the member states. That, for me, in the book, I describe to be the result of a third current of uncertainty, which is the fraying of the welfare state. Not so much the fraying of the welfare state as an institution, as a sort of structure of different benefits and safety nets, but mostly of the welfare state as a system of redistributing economic opportunities. Of course, in each society you have economic inequality, but what you see now is that the situation of what I call the bottom 40, the lowest two income quintiles, the 40% poorest people of Europe, are really losing out rapidly in terms of purchasing power, in terms of employment opportunities, and so on. And that also, and this is again going to be a decisive shift, that it now tends to spill over in the lower middle class. So that for the first time since a long time, we are going to have a structural social and economic problem that affects now the majority of the European population. And that reverses the positive current that we witnessed in the last 6 decades or so. And in the fourth layer, I describe as the altering of the economic balance of power at our expense. Europe bit by bit becoming less competitive, but Europe also becoming bit by bit more dependent on external debt. Government debt, to put it perhaps a bit bluntly, has nowadays has become the biggest and most successful export product of the European Union, and that's of course not a very encouraging trend.
Yeah. So even if we somehow miraculously get beyond the euro crisis, we get a banking union, growth comes back, youth unemployment drops, even if all this miracle happens, then still Europe is in major problems, you could say. So what do you think are the major threats on the, let's say, more the long term? Is it the inequality? Is it the political crisis? Let's say about 20 years' time.
I think it's the failure of Europe to provide tangible economic opportunities to the majority of its people. I think Europe as a political project, in spite of its complexity, is not an exception. Like each political project, it will only survive if it can visibly advance the interests of the majority of the people. And it's no longer able to do that, as the member states, and we have to be clear about that, are also no longer able to do that. I don't see at this time, with the current responses to the crises, the banking union, some efforts to create some new jobs amongst the youth, sufficient reassurances that we will turn the tide. So my prediction is that with the current policy proposals, we will slither further down into our legitimacy trap. And probably the European Union will fray. Again, with that remark, that for me the member states are offering no solution. Quite the contrary. I think in comparison to the past, the frictions and competition between the European countries can no longer be externalized on the rest of the world, but you will get a situation in which the frictions between the European member states will be exploited ruthlessly by the other major powers. And then we already see, for instance, in the last weeks, the Chinese president came here to visit the Netherlands, Germany, France and Belgium. And in spite of not giving anything in terms of clear concessions, in spite of making no clear gestures to Europe, still all the governments went on their knees, flat on the ground, and they walked over us, essentially. So here you see very well that getting things back to the level of the member states is certainly no guarantee for protecting the welfare, the standard of living, and I would venture to say also the security of the European citizens better than what we do with the European project nowadays.
Do you think that we are bound to lose the race with the BRICS? And you can interpret this question in any way you would like.
Yeah, well, I think there is a great chance that in the new power politics between the protagonists, China, India, the United States, Russia, Europe is not going to emerge as a player but as a playground. That indeed you will have a situation in which the internal fault lines will be exploited to the economic and political benefit of the others. Now, it's important to remark, nevertheless, that I don't think that the world order is characterized by new strong leaders. We are all fragile in our own way. I think China is struggling, India is in disarray almost. The United States is also having serious problems. But in such order characterized by fragile power, there is a greater tendency towards greed, selfishness, free riding, economic power politics, mercantilism, protectionism, and Europe fails to sort of play its game, to play its part in that game, fails also to master, I would say, a good balance between playing the new power politics and coming up with a narrative, with a grand story that is more hopeful, provides better opportunities for our own people, but also provides, and this is essential, probably better opportunities for the long chain of countries around us, what I call the belt of uncertainty, that also grapple with very tough and even dire economic, social and security realities.
Well, I'm calling it the ring of fire, where
yes.
you build stability. But looking at the Ukraine crisis, I've become quite skeptical about the willingness of probably the major countries, the bigger countries within the EU, to give up their national interest, because they're still playing their national interest in, you know, you've seen it in the battle within the council, for instance, about the sanctions on Russian politicians.
Well, very important is that I'm not sure that these member states, the Italians, the Spanish, the Brits, the Germans, are playing their national interest. I think they are basically departing from very short-sighted, opportunistic interests, not from basically what is the good for this generation of their citizens and also what's in the good of the next generation of citizens. And I think that's essential to highlight. I think it's sham power politics, it's sham statesmanship, it's not real. It's politicians pretending to pursue statecraft, whereas in fact they are selling out the future of their own citizens. What I think is missing is in Brussels an institution, a group of officials that is able to turn the natural differences in geopolitical orientations into a sort of consensus. As you have it in the United States and in India and in China, that different parts of the country have different geopolitical concerns, you also have that in Europe. But I think what especially the External Action Service ought to do, or foreign service, is to do less external action, more internal action. Yep. It has to invest in brokering this consensus. It has to explain why it's in the interest of the Swedes to mind the instability in North Africa, and why it's in the interest of the Italians to mind the interests of the Swedes vis-à-vis the power plays in the Arctic, what the Russians are doing, and so forth. Only by striking that geopolitical consensus, and also by explaining it to the people, not just to the governments, but to the people. We have to go to the national parliaments, to the news media and the member states. I think we can overcome the problem, and we can overcome it fairly easily. I think the message of Europe at the brink of drowning, submerging into its new complicated security environment is a very compelling one, and I think could even help us to turn the tide of Euroscepticism. We have to explain, and I think it's doable, our people, that we are in the same boat and that there's a tiny tailpiece of Eurasia. We really don't have any other option but to stick together. I think we are at a critical watershed between the era of euphoria about globalization and a new wave of national power politics. Why is that? First of all, obviously because globalization did not produce enough tangible benefits to the world population globally. If we just take Asia as an example, that's the region that we like to refer to when it's about economic success and growth. The average growth rate in Asia in the last 10 years was about 5–6%, right? The average inflation rate was 8 to 10%. So a lot of the benefits of growth have been just erased by inflation. The rich-poor divisions have become bigger. The environmental problems have become larger. So that's really key. And then I'm not even speaking about job creation. With 5%, 6% growth, we have only generated an increase in jobs annually of 0.2% in the region. So a lot of the growth was jobless as well. That's going to weaken the pro-globalization and pro-free trade elites. You see that in Japan, quite obviously. The backlash recently in Taiwan is another good example with the sunflower movement. You see it in Indonesia, you see it even to some extent in India. That will lead countries to try harder to, first of all, keep what they have in terms of economic activity and to divert the international trade flows. I don't think that there is an imminent risk of sort of new import tariffs war, but there will be a greater competition and context waged by different means, export credit, industrial policy and so forth, to divert the international flows of trade. That, I think, will hollow out the precarious consensus on free trade, on economic governance that we developed recently. So that's key. I think we are in for a period of very, very tough economic power politics that goes against the very economic DNA that's in the European institutions. And I think we're also in, because of the rise of new nationalism, for fiercer political and military power plays. I think that's a very important risk. We are reaching, I would say, another upward trend in the economic curve. We will have a tendency to slide back in economic problems globally, and that, I think, will make it more difficult to strike compromises, to make concessions in the territorial disputes and so forth that you have everywhere in the world. So I think this economic power politics will ultimately merge with military power politics, and we have learned from history that this confluence of two forms of power plays can be very dangerous. So I think that the chance that things spiral out of control in Asia is quite large, that will spill over into Europe's backyard, that new power plays will also manifest themselves in our neighborhood, will also be quite large, but also, and this is also something that I try to underscore in the book, that new power plays will migrate to the new spheres. We have, I think, fair to say, a new space race being about to start, a militarization of space that accelerates. We have the militarization of cyber, and that's just at its debut. And for me, this environment, this new context of ruthless power politics is again a reason for the Lilliputter states in Europe to join the ranks. Countries like France, like Britain, like Germany, but especially the first two who believe, or at least whose politicians tend to believe, that they can go solo in this world order, I think are mistaken and are fooling themselves. Now, I think that what reality bears a lot of resemblances with nowadays is with Italy in the 15th, 16th century. The time of Machiavelli writing his advices to the Medici and others, with also the Lilliputter states in Italy believing that they could use the great powers around them, the Austrians, the French, the Turks, to maintain their position. Whereas in fact reality showed that it was the opposite. It was the French, the Austrians and the Ottomans sort of trampling the Italian states because they couldn't agree, because they couldn't form partnerships and cooperation that was solid enough to deflect the ambitions of the others. I think the situation of Europe amidst the new great powers bears a lot of resemblances with that. And if you add to this also the economic dimension, the sense of relative economic scarcity of economic opportunities, I think it's really very, very, very gloomy. And for the time being, I can still not sense that the majority of decision makers here in Brussels is aware of that and is preparing to rise to the challenge. I think the legitimacy crisis, first of all, is not a crisis of institutions. That's very, very important. You have many people arguing, well, Europe has a lack of legitimacy because it's not democratic enough. I think Europe is one of the most democratic projects in the world, even in world history, certainly given its scale, like more than 500 million citizens. It's not peanuts to organize that in democratic structures that function also at the same time. I think it's more the legitimacy crisis is more a consequence of a lack of ideas, and that's as Mill already said it. What is a democracy? A democracy is a marketplace of ideas, and it only functions as long as there are enough ideas that appeal to the people and also explain the people how the political construction benefits to them. So I think what really has to happen is that amongst especially the pragmatic parties, you get a new progressive vision for Europe. Conservatism and economic orthodox policies, for me, are not enough. We cannot conserve the current standard of living if we sort of trample at the same place. We need to have a new progressive vision for Europe that provides in the maintenance of the standards of living of the European the youngsters, a new generation of Europeans, provides in their security, and especially comes up with a social project that is more dynamic, is more competitive, but it is also still solidary enough and more pleasant than what we have to do today. And that for me is a very important argument in the book as well.
What do you think should be the next, for the next Commission, the biggest priorities for their 5-year term?
Well, first of all, it's about form. The European Commission has to play politics, I think, more vigorously and more actively. I think we have to have a face of the Commission that is recognizable, and we have to have a voice that is convincing, that expresses empathy and understanding of what happens in the 28 countries. Secondly, I believe that Europe should have this ambitious vision for lifting the market up to a higher level. I really don't think that the solution is more rules. I don't think that the solution is more bureaucracy, but I do believe that we should have standards that allow our companies to create growth, to create jobs, to create government income without having to fear to be washed away from credit-supported imports from China and polluting shale gas-supported imports from the US, for instance. That's really essential that we lift up the playing field, and that should be pursued by forming the new grand alliance between the enterprises and the people. But I think it's mostly about form. The ideas, the visions often are quite obvious. But we have to learn to play politics with European institutions and be not afraid to go instantly to the people that we serve. And these are not governments in capitals. These are the people at the street, the 500 million European citizens.
In this interview, we've been talking a lot about themes from your new book, De Kracht van een Paradijs, The Power of Paradise. but you already almost finished your next book.
Yes.
And what is this about, and when will it be published?
The new book will be again about China. I essentially have to do that to keep the balance a bit here at the university. So I'm supposed to look at Asia and after the Europe book. So I thought it was appropriate to do this on China. It basically argues that the peaceful rise will become quite difficult in China's Asian environment, and I will develop that book by drawing a lot from very concrete policy documents, interviews with Chinese officials, and so forth. So that's basically my project for the short term, and then afterwards I probably go back again more to the broader international reality, and this kind of variation I enjoy a lot.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you.